Claressa Shields may have just delivered the one response that turns this entire Remy Ma situation upside down. Because while people have been dissecting Remy's latest bars and connecting the clearance and secondhand references back to Claressa, Claressa chose a completely different weapon. She didn't release a diss track, she didn't break down Remy's lyrics one by one, and she didn't need a long speech. Instead, she dropped one sentence in an interview that was almost guaranteed to become a headline. "I don't beef with bleep, I beat them." But there's one detail we need to establish immediately, because it actually makes this story more interesting. Claressa does not directly say Remy Ma's name in that statement. The quote is real, but connecting it specifically to Remy requires context from everything already happening around these women. So the question isn't simply whether Claressa fired back. It's whether she delivered a broad message that conveniently lands right in the middle of the Remy drama, without ever giving Remy the satisfaction of a direct name drop.
I beat them. So any girl thinking she beefing with me, if you don't want to get beat, you better go find somebody else to beef with. I don't beef with bitches, bro. I beat them.
Listen closely to the full wording because "I don't beef with bleep, I beat them" is obviously the part everybody remembers, but Claressa's broader point matters just as much. She says she doesn't beef with anybody, and essentially tells any woman who believes there's a problem to find somebody else. So technically, Claressa is rejecting the idea that she's participating in a back and forth at all. Yet she does it with arguably the most confrontational soundbite in the interview. And that contradiction is exactly why this clip hits harder than a simple, "I'm not involved." Because look at what has been happening on the other side. Remy Ma has new material circulating where she talks about women watching her posts, being in her DMs, asking where she gets things, and then moves into shopping wordplay involving clearance rack, being the real deal, and eventually calling an unnamed woman secondhand. Remy doesn't explicitly identify Claressa in the audio we've been discussing either, but because of the history involving Papoose, listeners immediately started decoding those lines as possible subliminals aimed at Claressa. And that creates the first major reversal. If listeners hear Remy say clearance and conclude that she means Claressa, then those same listeners are naturally going to hear Claressa talking about women who think they have beef with her and conclude that she means Remy. Neither woman necessarily has to name the other anymore because the audience already knows the history connecting them. Social media effectively becomes the messenger, carrying every ambiguous lyric and interview quote from one side of the feud to the other before either woman confirms exactly who she meant. But Claressa does something strategically interesting with her response. Remy's arena is rap. Claressa's arena is boxing. If Claressa tries to compete with Remy Ma bar for bar, she's stepping directly onto Remy's home field. Instead, "I don't beef with them, I beat them" changes the scoreboard entirely. Claressa pulls the conversation away from rap and social media shade and redirects it toward the one arena where her credentials speak for themselves: professional fighting. That doesn't automatically mean Claressa won the exchange, because there's an obvious contradiction sitting inside that strategy. If you genuinely believe you're above the drama, why deliver a line this quotable while talking about beef? Claressa could have simply said she ignores outside noise and moved forward, but instead she gave social media the perfect soundbite. Whether that was intentional or simply the way Claressa naturally talks, the result is identical. People can clip those seconds, place Remy's picture beside them, and suddenly the indirect feud has another chapter. And tell me what you heard when that clip played. Did that sound like Claressa sending Remy a message without needing to say her name? Or are people forcing Remy into a statement Claressa meant more generally? Keep your answer in mind because later in the same interview Claressa gets a broader question about all the craziness happening on social media. Her answer there matters because instead of getting pulled deeper into the drama, she reveals exactly how she wants the public to see her while all of this is happening. Claressa doesn't suddenly start listing every person who has mentioned her. She doesn't break down every lyric, allegation, post, or rumor surrounding Papoose. Instead, she paints a completely different picture of her life. Successful, focused, accomplished, and largely uninterested in whatever chaos social media keeps attaching to her name. And once she establishes that image, she circles right back to the same philosophy that made the first clip explode.
What's going on? How do you stay focused with all the craziness on social media that you go through? How do you stay focused for your fight? What's going on? Nothing. My fight. My fight. Nothing. Ain't nothing going on. But good life. August 15th. Go out arena. I'm fighting out arenas and bitches is rapping on street corners. Right. It's not
Now that second clip gives us something the viral 10-second version doesn't. Claressa is specifically asked about the craziness on social media and how she stays focused, and instead of presenting herself as overwhelmed by it, she talks about living the good life, being number one in her field, and what she has accomplished before returning to the "I don't beef, I beat them" message. Suddenly that first quote isn't floating by itself anymore. It becomes part of a broader attempt by Claressa to define herself through success rather than whatever feud people want her dragged into. And this is where Remy Ma's apparent approach and Claressa's approach genuinely collide. Remy's interpreted message is about attention. Unnamed women watching her posts, paying attention to what she has, asking where she gets things, and then getting hit with shopping-based insults. Claressa's posture is almost the exact opposite. She's presenting herself as somebody too focused on her own accomplishments to participate in that competition. In the simplest terms, Remy's interpreted message says, "You're watching me," while Claressa's posture says, "I'm not even beefing with you." That clash becomes even more personal once Papoose enters the interpretation. Without that history, clearance could simply be shopping wordplay and Claressa's interview could simply be a boxer dismissing critics. But Remy's history with Papoose and Papoose's relationship with Claressa give audiences a ready-made context for every ambiguous line. That's especially true with secondhand, because listeners can easily interpret that phrase as something much deeper than an insult about shopping once they start asking what, or who, could supposedly be secondhand. And that may actually be the nastier piece of wordplay. Clearance catches attention because people hear the possible Claressa connection immediately, but secondhand potentially moves the insult toward the relationship itself. If listeners are interpreting it correctly, the implication would be that Claressa has something Remy had first. Remy does not explicitly explain that meaning in the material we're discussing, so it remains interpretation, but the Papoose history explains exactly why audiences are reading the line that way instead of hearing it as a random insult. Now look at what Claressa does instead of answering that possible jab. She doesn't explain whether she watches Remy online, she doesn't defend her relationship, and she doesn't start decoding clearance or secondhand. She refuses the entire frame and talks about fighting, winning, being number one, and enjoying her life. Strategically, that matters because the moment Claressa starts answering every interpreted Remy lyric individually, she's allowing Remy to dictate the conversation and putting herself in the position of defending against a narrative she never publicly agreed was about her. That refusal is probably Claressa's strongest move in the interview, but it comes with a price. Saying you're not participating in the beef while delivering "I beat them" gives the internet something even easier to circulate than a detailed response. So Claressa avoids answering Remy on Remy's terms, but she creates a completely new headline on her own terms. And that means the interview can simultaneously support two competing narratives. Claressa is above the drama, or Claressa is responding while insisting she isn't. The second clip strengthens Claressa's side of that argument because she repeatedly brings everything back to accomplishments. When she talks about being number one and points toward what she has achieved, she's essentially telling viewers what scoreboard she wants them using. The public conversation keeps trying to define Claressa through Remy Ma and Papoose, while Claressa is trying to define herself through boxing. That difference matters because every minute she spends answering relationship drama is another minute where somebody else's personal history becomes the headline instead of her own career. From Remy's side, though, there's an equally obvious counterargument. Remy Ma is a rapper and personal experiences, relationships, public disputes, betrayals and rivalries have always become material for rap. If Remy believes something from her own life deserves to become a bar, music is naturally where she's going to express it. So the real debate isn't whether Remy is allowed to rap about what happened around her. It's whether audiences are correctly identifying Claressa as the target of these particular lines. And that's where a direct response becomes dangerous for both women. If Remy explicitly says the clearance material was aimed at Claressa, the mystery disappears and everybody knows exactly who the target was. If Claressa explicitly says "I beat them" was aimed at Remy, she confirms Remy was important enough to answer. Right now, both women benefit from ambiguity because audiences keep debating the exchange without either side having to fully own the confrontation. That may actually explain why this story keeps generating so much conversation. The audience isn't simply watching two celebrities argue. It's being asked to decode them. One side drops bars that people believe contain hidden references, The other gives an interview quote that people believe is an indirect answer, and Papoose provides the relationship history connecting both interpretations. Every unresolved piece gives viewers another reason to argue over what was really meant, even though the direct evidence remains much narrower than the social media narrative. Subscribe to Daily Spills for the next actual receipt in this story, because another repost of the same 10-second quote isn't what changes this situation. What changes it is Remy Ma directly addressing Claressa's interview, Claressa Shields explicitly identifying who she meant, or Papoose saying something that changes how these bars are being interpreted. Any one of those developments would give us new information instead of another round of people attaching names to ambiguous statements. And until that happens, the two interview clips tell us more than speculation does. The first gives us Claressa's blunt philosophy: she doesn't beef, she beats. The second shows how she wants to frame herself when directly asked about social media craziness: successful, focused, living well, and unwilling to let outside drama become her identity. Whether you believe that completely or think the "I beat them" line proves she's more engaged than she admits, at least those are arguments based on what she actually said. They also reveal why Remy Ma versus Claressa Shields is such an unusual matchup. Remy projects dominance through language, wordplay, subliminals, and memorable insults. Claressa projects it through physical competition, championship status, and confidence in what she has accomplished as a fighter. When social media forces those two languages onto the same scoreboard, each woman can appear to be winning according to a game the other woman never agreed to play. And that leaves Papoose in perhaps the strangest position of all. He's central to why audiences interpret the material this way, yet he's absent from the most viral exchange itself. The second-hand line becomes a potential relationship jab because of him, and Claressa's comments get attached to Remy largely because of the same history. Yet the public conversation increasingly becomes Remy versus Claressa, while the man connecting the two narratives quietly moves into the background. So before declaring a winner, there's a bigger question worth considering. How much of this rivalry belongs to Remy and Claressa, and how much of it is being constructed by the audience around their connection through Papoose? Remy can make music containing personal shade without every lyric automatically being about Claressa. Claressa can dismiss women criticizing her without every sentence automatically being about Remy. The overlap is what makes the story irresistible, but overlap alone isn't the same thing as confirmation. Still, there's no getting around how powerful Claressa's quote is. "I don't beef with bleep, I beat them" was never likely to disappear quietly inside a longer interview, especially while people were already waiting for some kind of reaction to Remy's music. Whether Claressa intended Remy specifically or not, the quote has now become attached to the Remy versus Claressa conversation, and only a direct clarification from one of the women can really settle that interpretation. And that brings us to the actual payoff. Claressa Shields absolutely delivered the "I don't beef with bleep, I beat them" line, and later, while discussing social media craziness and her own success, she returned to that same broader philosophy. What the interview does not give us is Claressa directly saying, "Remy Ma, this is for you." The direct clapback interpretation comes from the timing, Remy's new music, the Papoose connection, and the history audiences already bring into the clip. That distinction actually makes the next move more important. If Remy Ma directly answers Claressa's quote, the debate changes instantly because the indirect stage is over. If Remy ignores it, Claressa keeps the hardest soundbite without receiving a direct response. And if Claressa eventually says she wasn't talking about Remy at all, then everybody who treated these two clips like a confirmed face-to-face exchange will have to reconsider how much of the feud was interpretation rather than explicit statements. So drop your final verdict. Was Claressa clearly talking to Remy without saying her name, or did the internet turn a general statement into a direct clapback because everybody was already waiting for one? And if you're Remy, do you answer "I don't beef with them, I beat them"? Or do you leave those clearance and secondhand bars out there and let listeners continue connecting the dots themselves? Because right now both women still have plausible deniability, both sides can argue their favorite landed the harder shot, and Papoose remains the connection keeping the entire argument alive. But the moment either Remy Ma or Claressa Shields finally says the other woman's name directly, the guessing stops. And that's when this stops being a subliminal feud and becomes a real one.